You wake to the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps, each one echoing off stone corridors as if the palace itself were whispering your fate. They grow louder, then pause, then begin again, like someone reluctant to reach your door. Your small hands clutch at the scratchy wool blanket pulled to your chin. It smells faintly of mildew, damp stone, and something else, the stale scent of a room where the air is never fully fresh. Beyond the narrow slit of a window, Vienna's winter light is trying to break through, a pale blade cutting across the roofs of 1793. In other rooms of the Hofburg Palace, gilded ceilings catch the sunrise in gold fire, but here, in this forgotten chamber tucked beneath the roofline, no sunlight ever fully enters. Your world is dim and airless. You're 7 years old, though no one has ever told you that. No one has told you much of anything. They once called you Ferdinand, though the name is rarely spoken now. It belonged to a boy who was introduced to the court as a prince, son of the Emperor Leopold II. But that boy exists only in the ledgers and family trees. In this room, you are not a prince. You are something hidden a secret the palace would prefer not to remember, and if the mind behind those Habsburg features works differently than the world expects, then royal blood is no protection. Here, that blood might as well be water. The door opens without a knock. The woman who steps inside is not a governess, not a nurse, but someone paid to keep you fed and out of sight. She avoids your eyes. She always avoids your eyes. Those eyes almond-shaped. Set in a face the court whispers is marked are the reason you are here. In the kingdom's polite language, you are delicate. In the harsher language of the servants' hall, you are wrong. And wrongness has no place in a dynasty that claims its power from God himself. She sets down a wooden bowl. The porridge inside is already cold. The skin forming across its surface, she says nothing, not even your name. There are never words not for you. The door closes, and the sound of her retreating steps fades into silence. Outside these walls, cousins and siblings are learning Latin declensions, practicing courtly bows, rehearsing diplomatic phrases they will someday use to bind kingdoms together. They will be dressed in silk and measured for portraits that will hang in galleries for centuries, here, in your room. The only motion comes from the slow dance of dust motes caught in a single shaft of light. You watch them for hours because there is nothing else to watch. You learn their movements the way other children learn the words of songs. The palace's grand halls are painted with scenes of divine triumph, angels crowning monarchs, clouds parting to reveal heaven's blessing. But no painter would ever be allowed to capture what is in this room, the hunched figure of a boy staring at particles of dust, fingers twitching against a fraying blanket, the light catching in eyes that see everything yet are granted nothing. You do not know why the world outside has stopped coming to you. You do not know why the servants lower their voices when they pass your door, and you do not know that centuries from now, people will give your condition a name, Down syndrome, and understand that the way your mind works is not a curse, not a punishment, but a variation of nature itself, for now. All you know is the cold porridge, the still air, and the silence. History will one day write about emperors, treaties, and wars fought in the name of dynastic power. But for you, power has only meant disappearance. It has meant the slow erosion of days that all look the same. Somewhere in the palace, your name still exists, pressed in ink beside the names of siblings who will be remembered. But in this room, that name has been taken from you, replaced by the sound of nothing at all. And yet, in the stillness, there is a strange, fragile defiance. The dust motes still dance, no matter how small the light. You still breathe, no matter how completely the world tries to erase you. You do not know it, but you are not the only one. In palaces across Europe, other children sit in other hidden rooms, waiting for footsteps, for a door to open, for someone to remember they exist. But for now, all you can do is watch the dust swirl in the beam of morning light, your only companion, your only proof that the world beyond your locked door still moves. Beyond the tower walls, the court functions as if nothing is amiss. Servants glide through marble corridors, carrying silver trays and folded proclamations. Pages scurry after ministers, relaying whispered instructions. In the throne room, courtiers bow so deeply their foreheads almost touch the polished floor. The monarchy is a theatre of perfection, and every actor must know their lines. There is no place for improvisation, and no role written for a child who will never master the performance. In the gilded mirror of royal ideology, children are not just heirs. They are living symbols, currency to be spent in the great transactions of power. A son might be betrothed to secure a treaty, a daughter offered as a diplomatic bridge between rival kingdoms. The worth of a royal child is measured in what they can offer the dynasty: intelligence for governance, grace for diplomacy, beauty for alliance. Anything less disrupts the machinery. A child born different, with a mind that wanders outside the straight lines of court etiquette, with hands that fidget rather than salute, with speech that comes in broken rhythms, is not seen as an individual. They are a liability, and in a system built on the illusion of divine selection, even a single visible flaw in the bloodline is a dangerous crack in the foundation. In rural villages, the rules are different. A peasant mother might still feel the shock of difference, might still grieve the life she imagined for her child, but she is free from the crushing weight of diplomacy. A child unable to plough the fields might still feed the chickens, carry water, or bring laughter to the hearth. Faith often frames such children as God's will, perhaps even touched by holiness. They live in sight of their neighbours, known by name, woven into the community's fabric. For royalty, there is no such sanctuary. The gaze upon them is relentless. Foreign envoys study every gesture at court dinners. Chroniclers record every public word. A prince who struggles to remember a toast or drops a ceremonial goblet can become the subject of political rumour. Whispers breed suspicion. Suspicion breeds instability. In an age when crowns are often won and lost through perception, perception becomes everything. And so, when a royal child shows signs of difference, decisions are made quickly and quietly. Sometimes the record says they died young. Sometimes they are sent to a remote estate for health reasons. Sometimes they are raised within palace walls, but in rooms no guest will ever see. The details vary, but the result is the same: disappearance. This secrecy is not born only of cruelty. In the minds of kings and queens, it is a form of protection for the child from public mockery, protection for the dynasty from political weakness. But protection built on erasure still erases. Behind every sealed door is a child who watches seasons change through a narrow window, knowing nothing of why they are there. To understand how deep this instinct runs, you have to look beyond one kingdom, beyond one century, across Europe, from Tudor England to Bourbon France, from the Romanovs in Russia to the Habsburgs in Spain. The same pattern repeats: birth, recognition of difference, removal from sight. The names change, the rooms change, the silence never does. This is the impossible dilemma of royalty: to preserve the perfection of the crown. They must sometimes cut away pieces of their own blood, and once cut, those pieces vanish into history's shadows, where only scraps of rumour and faded letters remain to prove they ever lived. On a winter's morning in 1905 at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate, a healthy royal infant was born, the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary. His name was John, and for his first years he lived in the sunlight of royal favour. Photographs from those early days show a rosy-cheeked boy in miniature sailor suits, his hand held by elder siblings, his face turned curiously toward the camera. He was presented to dignitaries, passed from one doting relative to another, a small but essential part of the royal tableau. Then, around his 4th birthday, the light began to dim. The seizures came first, sudden storms that left his small body shaking uncontrollably. Alongside the epilepsy came signs his development was different. He struggled to keep pace with lessons. His speech carried a softness that set him apart, and his features, even in photographs, bore the quiet hallmarks of what modern medicine would call Down syndrome. In the language of the time, no diagnosis was given, no official acknowledgement was made. By 1909, John was gone from public life entirely. No more photographs, no more appearances at family gatherings. The explanation offered to the press was vague: his health required quiet surroundings. In truth, he had been moved to Wood Farm, a modest house on the Sandringham grounds, far from the palace's ceremonial corridors, there, under the devoted care of his nurse, Charlotte Lala Bill. His world narrowed to the rhythm of simple pleasures. Queen Alexandra, his grandmother, wrote in her diary about visiting poor little Johnny. She described him collecting acorns in the gardens, watching the gardeners work, laughing at games only he seemed to understand. There was affection in her words, but also distance, the kind of distance that comes when the court decides a child's life is better, lived out of sight. His siblings visited rarely, discouraged by parents who believed separation was kinder. In January 1919, after a particularly violent seizure, John died in his sleep. He was 13. Queen Mary, in a letter to a friend, called his death a great mercy for the poor little soul. That phrase, a great mercy, echoes through the centuries in royal correspondence about children like him, carrying both sorrow and the unspoken belief that a life lived differently is not worth its full span. Yet in the quiet rooms of Wood Farm, a different story had unfolded. Lalla Bill kept every drawing John made, every little object he treasured. She remembered a boy who loved music, who fed sugar lumps to the ponies, who laughed with his whole body, in her care. He had been simply John, not a liability, not a shame, but a child with a life full of moments that mattered to him. After his death, Lalla was quietly pensioned off, the mementos of those years boxed away. Official history reduced him to a footnote, but in the private memory of the woman who held his hand through seizures and storms, he was a boy whose joy could fill a room, even if the world had decided never to see it. In the spring of 1640, whispers moved through the corridors of the Palais du Louvre, whispers that travelled from the royal nursery to the servants' hall, from the chapel's shadowed alcoves to the chambers of the Queen herself. Anne of Austria, wife of King Louis XIII, had given birth to another son. On paper, this was cause for celebration. Another male child to secure the Bourbon line, a younger brother to the future Sun King, Louis XIV. But the rejoicing was muted, strained, almost artificial. The boy, those who had seen him said, was frail. His eyes had an unusual almond shape. His tiny nose seemed flattened at the bridge. A single crease marked the palm of each hand. His tongue, larger than his mouth could quite contain, pushed forward when he cried, "Today." We would recognize these as features of Down syndrome in the 17th century. They were read as signs not of genetics, but of God's displeasure. Officially, the infant was described only as weak and delicate. Court records note his baptism and little else. The official gazette never announced his name. A few weeks later, the boy's existence was reduced to a line more en bas âge, died in infancy, but in the Vatican's secret archives, centuries later, historians would uncover private letters between royal physicians describing the same child in unvarnished detail. The wet nurse was interrogated, accused of negligence. She swore she had done nothing wrong, that she had fed him faithfully, kept him warm, protected him. But in an era when royal children were expected to embody strength and perfection, infant death demanded an explanation. Superstition moved in where science could not. Some said the Queen was being punished for the king's sins. Others whispered about her Spanish heritage, darkly implying a taint in the bloodline. A few even consulted astrologers, charting the stars on the night of conception, searching for celestial evidence that this child was never meant to live. The truth was far simpler, and far sadder. Congenital heart defects affect nearly half of all babies born with Down syndrome, in an age before surgeons could mend such hearts. Survival was a matter of chance. After 43 days of life, the prince's chance was over. Anne of Austria commissioned special prayers. She made pilgrimages to sacred shrines. Whether she mourned as a mother or sought redemption as a queen, no one could say. She never spoke of the child again. His name, if he had one, was not recorded. No portrait was painted, no monument raised. All that remains is a handful of letters, brittle with age, describing a newborn who lived less than 2 months yet managed to disturb the serenity of a kingdom. His short life did not change the course of French history, but it left an invisible mark, proof that even in the house of the future Sun King, not every child was born to shine under the eyes of the world. In 1882, within the opulent walls of the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, a child was born to Grand Duke Vladimir Alexandrovich, a son of Tsar Alexander II. Official bulletins to the court announced the arrival of a healthy daughter, but curiously, her name never appeared in the genealogies of the Romanov family. She was referred to only in passing, As the youngest daughter, a detail so thin it could have been a printing error. For most of the empire, she simply did not exist, but in the palace payroll records, quietly filed away. A strange pattern emerged. Year after year, wages were paid to the same small staff assigned to the East Wing nursery, long after an infant death would have ended such appointments. Servants who worked there told no one what they saw, but a few fragments of truth slipped into private letters exchanged among the ladies in waiting. They described a girl with a round, cherubic face, whose speech never developed beyond a handful of slurred words. At 14, she still cradled dolls meant for toddlers, combing their hair with meticulous care. She laughed at the snow as if seeing it for the first time each winter, often rushing barefoot onto the frost-covered balcony before a nurse could catch her. She seemed untouched by courtly ambition, and in a family where ambition was the air everyone breathed, this made her both precious and dangerous. The imperial family, obsessed with appearances, chose silence. Visits from siblings were rare. Public acknowledgement was non-existent, but within her guarded nursery. She lived a life of small rhythms, morning walks in the walled gardens, afternoons arranging coloured ribbons in neat rows, evenings listening to music boxes until she fell asleep. Then, in the turbulent autumn of 1917, the revolution came. Gunfire cracked across Petrograd, and the palaces became both prisons and targets. Servants fled, family members scattered across Europe in hurried exile, and in the chaos, the girl in the East Wing simply vanished. What happened in those final days is still a question without an answer. Did the Red Guards storm her nursery, their shouts and boots terrifying a young woman who could not understand their words? Did a loyal servant spirit her away into the countryside, passing her off as a relative's simple-minded daughter, or, in the cruel calculus of survival, did her fleeing family decide she could not endure the journey and leave her behind? Nobody was ever found. No grave was marked. The revolution erased her as thoroughly as the imperial court once had, and yet, in rare moments, her ghost seems to step forward in a faded photograph of the East Wing Gardens, in a half-burned diary page found decades later. A life lived in the margins, ending in a silence even deeper than the one she was born into. By the late 17th century, Spain's Habsburg dynasty had become a living experiment in the dangers of inbreeding. Cousin married cousin, uncle wed niece. Each union intended to preserve the so-called purity of royal blood. But with each generation, the genetic pool narrowed and the cracks began to show. Charles II, known as El Hechizado the Bewitched, is the most famous result. His jaw was so deformed he could barely chew. His speech was slurred, his body frail. He did not walk until he was 8, and he never fathered an heir. Chroniclers described his life with a mix of pity and superstition, convinced he was cursed by witchcraft. But Charles was only the visible tip of an iceberg of hidden lives, in private Latin notes, carefully disguised in the margins of medical texts. Spanish court physicians recorded the births of infants with facies mongolica, the period's crude term for what we now call Down syndrome. They never named these children in official ledgers. Instead, their identities were scratched from baptismal rolls, their portraits left unfinished or destroyed. One physician, Diego Mateo Zapata, broke with the quiet cruelty of his peers. In 1693, he examined a young princess whose name would later be erased from the royal record. She was tiny for her age, her heart weak, her speech slow and often tangled, but Zapata noticed something others did not bother to record: the way she hugged every visitor as if they were an old friend, the joy on her face when musicians played, the way she moved her feet to rhythms only she seemed to hear. In his notes, Zapata dared to suggest that such children might not be divine punishment at all, but part of God's variety in creation. It was a dangerous thought. The Inquisition summoned him, demanding he recant. His refusal sealed his fate. He was tried, convicted, and eventually burned. Before his death, Zapata hid his notes in a false bottom of a medical volume, hoping someone in a more enlightened age might read them. There they remained, undiscovered until 1954, when a Spanish archivist stumbled upon the brittle pages. The handwriting was faded, but the sentiment was still alive. Perhaps these children are not cursed. Perhaps they are simply different. It is one of the few surviving pieces of evidence that in the heart of a court obsessed with perfection, someone once looked at a hidden child and saw not shame, but humanity. Yet for the countless others born into the Habsburg palaces and swiftly erased from them, no such record remains. Their lives were as brief in history's pages as the ink it took to strike their names away. In 1595, Sultan Mehmed III ascended the throne of the Ottoman Empire, inheriting not only a vast realm but a brutal tradition to secure the succession. Brothers of the new sultan were often executed by his reign. This had evolved into a different form of confinement, the cafes, the cage, a set of lavish but locked chambers within the Topkapi Palace where potential heirs were kept in isolation. Watched day and night by eunuch guards, among the princes recorded as deceased in infancy during Mehmed's rule. One stands out in the whispers of palace memoirs. He had been born with features and mannerisms that set him apart, eyes that tilted softly upward, a slower gait, a gaze that lingered with childlike wonder. Modern observers would recognize these signs as consistent with Down syndrome, but in the rigid world of Ottoman succession, any deviation from the ideal of a strong, calculating ruler was a mortal liability. Officially, the boy died before his first birthday. In reality, he was sent into the cafes not as a rival to the throne, but as a secret the dynasty preferred to keep contained. There, he lived for 23 years. His rooms were filled with silks, rugs, and cushions. Yet his world was confined to 4 walls and the view of a single, latticed window. The guards who tended him later recalled sounds unlike those from any other prince in the cafes. No angry demands for news, no plotting whispers, only laughter at odd hours, and the same songs hummed over and over until they became part of the stone itself. Servants brought him coloured glass pieces, thinking to amuse him. He began arranging them into intricate mosaics across the floor, swirling suns, geometric gardens, patterns so delicate they seemed to shimmer when the afternoon light slanted through the lattice. When Sultan Ahmed III died in 1617, the cafes was opened to account for all surviving princes. One guard's memoir, written decades later in exile, describes the scene when they entered this man's chamber. He was seated cross-legged among thousands of glass pieces, beaming at his visitors, eager to show the worlds he had built in colour and light. His mind was still that of a child, untouched by the intrigues of the court. The records fall silent after that moment. No official note of his fate, no burial recorded, no prayer offered in the palace mosque. He simply disappears from history again, the door closing behind him for the last time. Somewhere beneath Topkapi's domes, perhaps in an unmarked grave within the palace gardens, lies the man who spent 2 decades creating beauty no one was meant to see. His glass mosaics are gone, swept away by servants who never knew what they were erasing. All that remains is the faint memory in an old guard's memoir of a prince who never ruled but who, for a brief moment, ruled a kingdom of colour entirely his own. In 1826, the bells of Munich rang in celebration. Another princess had been born into the Wittelsbach dynasty. She was christened Alexandra, her arrival marked with the usual fanfare, church bells, gun salutes, and a formal announcement to the court. But while her name appeared in the royal ledger, it would never be spoken in public again after her 3rd year. Her earliest portraits, sketched by a court artist, were left unfinished. Servants later whispered that the king had ordered the canvases removed from the studio entirely. The reason was simple: Alexandra's development did not match that of her royal siblings. She spoke late, walked with an unsteady step, and preferred the company of her nursemaids to the etiquette drills demanded by the governess. Her almond-shaped eyes and gentle demeanour would have been familiar to any modern doctor. But in the early 19th century, they became a justification for her quiet removal from the royal stage. She was relocated to what the servants called the quiet wing of Nymphenburg Palace, a series of rooms overlooking the palace gardens, well away from the formal halls and reception chambers. Her life there was neither cruel nor free. She had caretakers, meals on time, and a warm bed. But she was never permitted to mingle with visiting dignitaries or appear in public festivals. A diary, later donated to the Bavarian State Library by her former governess, offers the most intimate glimpse of her life. The entries are simple but vivid, teaching Alexandra to hold a spoon without spilling, helping her button her own gown, guiding her fingers along the raised edges of wooden letters so she might learn to recognize the shapes. Progress was slow, but her joy was quick, especially when she succeeded at some small task. Alexandra's favourite companions were a pair of bright yellow canaries kept in a gilded cage. She would sit for hours by the window, humming softly to them, her head tilting at their trills as though they were speaking in a secret language meant only for her. The governess noted how the princess would smile most when the canaries sang in the morning light, a moment of happiness untouched by court politics or the weight of the crown. This, in its way, was kindness. Unlike many of her hidden counterparts across Europe, Alexandra was not locked away in darkness or abandoned to strangers, but even kindness had its limits. She was not allowed to walk beyond the gardens without escort. She never attended a ball or saw the grandeur of the royal theatre. Her existence was known to only a handful of trusted servants, and as the years passed, even they began to speak of her less. In 1851, at the age of 25, Alexandra died quietly in her rooms. There was no public mourning, no grand procession through the streets of Munich. She was buried in an unmarked section of the royal crypt, her name omitted from the service. The royal court returned to its business the next morning as though nothing had happened. Yet, in that quiet wing, the canaries still sang, and perhaps, for a few days after she was gone, they tilted their heads at the empty chair by the window, waiting for the girl who had loved them so completely. In 1734, Lisbon's royal court was still basking in the wealth of Brazil's gold mines, and King João V of Portugal presided over a realm of glittering churches and endless ceremony. That year, Queen Maria Anna of Austria gave birth to a daughter, Infanta Maria Francisca. As was custom, the court painter, Jean Ranc, was summoned to immortalize the newborn in an official portrait, but the portrait was never completed. Months later, Ranc abruptly left Portugal for Madrid, his commission unpaid, and the sketches he had begun were burned at the king's command. The reason, whispered behind fans and in servants' corridors, was that no amount of artistic skill could reshape the infant's features into the ideal the monarchy demanded. The wide-set eyes, the small nose, the protruding tongue details the painter could not erase without betraying reality. Maria Francisca's life unfolded not in the grand halls of Ribeira Palace, but within the thick stone walls of the convent of Santos o Novo. Hidden in the city's eastern quarter, there, she was cared for by a small group of nuns who were bound by both their vows and the king's orders to keep her secluded. The convent's records, preserved in neat, looping script, describe a child who was drawn to the simplest tasks. She liked folding altar cloths, even if the creases were uneven. She carried bread to the cloister's pigeons, her laughter scattering them into the sunlit courtyard. During prayers, she would hum tunelessly, sometimes matching the rhythm, sometimes drifting into her own melody. She never learned to read, and the longer catechisms eluded her. But the sisters noticed her instinct for kindness, the way she would pat a weeping novice's shoulder or offer a crumb of bread to a visiting beggar. Her parents visited only once, arriving with a retinue that filled the convent's courtyard with liveried guards. The meeting lasted less than an hour. The Queen kissed her daughter's forehead. The King remained by the door when they left. They did not speak her name aloud again. In the summer of 1745, Maria Francisca fell ill with a fever that did not break. The nuns tended her in shifts, bathing her brow, spooning broth past lips that could no longer swallow, when she died. The sisters sent a formal request to the court, asking permission to bury her in the convent cemetery rather than return her body to the palace. Permission was granted almost immediately, some said with relief. Her grave marker was a simple wooden cross, carved with 3 words, Filha de Deus, God's child. No name, no dates, no acknowledgement of her royal blood. To the world, she had never been born. To the nuns, she had been a soul worth loving, and in the silence of the convent's garden, her resting place blended into the rows of the forgotten, where only the wind and the tolling of the church bells remembered her. In 1803, Copenhagen celebrated the birth of a new royal son, Prince Gustav, the child of Crown Prince Frederick, later King Frederick VI, and Crown Princess Marie of Hesse Castle. Public proclamations praised his arrival, but within the palace, courtiers quickly noticed that Gustav was unlike other princes. His development lagged. His gaze wandered in ways the tutors could not control, and his speech came late and never fully matched the polished diction expected of a future statesman. The Danish court, ever concerned with appearances before the European stage, devised a fiction. They announced that the young prince suffered from a nervous condition requiring constant travel for his health. Over the years, dispatches would report his stays in Italy, his convalescence in the Alps, or his retreats to coastal estates. In reality, Gustav was shuttled between remote royal properties within Denmark itself, each chosen for its isolation. He never remained long enough in one place for locals to grow curious. His tutors were not preparing him for governance but for survival in a controlled world. They taught him to light a fire without scorching himself, to find his way back to the house from the gardens, to recognize coins and their values. Letters from one such tutor, Hans Eriksson, preserved in the royal archives, reveal a man torn between loyalty to the court and affection for his pupil. Eriksson described Gustav's uncanny recall how he could remember the name of every servant he had met years earlier, and his habit of predicting weather changes days in advance with startling accuracy. He also noted the boy's strange, almost instinctive ability to tell when someone was lying. Perhaps, Eriksson wrote in one unguarded moment, we measure intelligence too narrowly. The prince understands things I do not, sees patterns I cannot perceive. Who, then, truly has the deficit, him, or those of us who cannot enter his world? But such thoughts found no sympathy in the court. For them, Gustav's difference was a weakness to be hidden, not understood. As the years passed, the fiction of his travels continued. Foreign visitors to Denmark asked after him only to be told he was abroad for treatment. The truth was that his life unfolded in quiet rooms, far from the pomp of Copenhagen, surrounded only by those paid to keep his world small. In 1834, Gustav died at 31 years old, officially of pneumonia, but more likely from a heart defect common in Down syndrome. The news announced that he had passed away in Italy, seeking the gentle climate his health required. His body, however, returned to Denmark under the cover of night and was buried before dawn in a private ceremony. In the official genealogy, his life was reduced to a single line: Prince Gustav, 1803-1834. No mention of the places he lived, the people who loved him, or the quiet talents that might have redefined what it meant to be royal. The fiction survived him, just as intended. In 1852, within the walls of Stockholm's royal palace, a child was born into the relatively new Bernadotte dynasty, Prince Carlos. The official announcement to the Swedish press was brief, almost perfunctory, and just 3 months later a follow-up statement declared that the infant had died. Courtiers expressed polite sorrow, and the court moved on. But the truth was more complex. Unofficial records, discreet physician bills, food requisitions, and servants' testimonies tell another story. Prince Carlos did not die in infancy. Instead, he was quietly relocated to Tullgarn Palace, a summer estate some 30 miles from Stockholm. There, surrounded by gardens and forests, he lived far from the public gaze. The most vivid account comes decades later from the memoir of a groundskeeper's son. As a boy, he had played in the palace gardens during the summer months, where he occasionally encountered a strange but cheerful boy who never seemed to speak. This boy, barefoot in the grass, his hair unkempt, his smile broad, laughed constantly, as though the world itself were one long joke. He feared neither strangers nor animals, once walking calmly among grazing deer as if they were part of his play. One summer afternoon, the groundskeeper's son watched as the boy crouched in the dirt for hours, utterly transfixed by a colony of ants. He followed their paths with a stick, blocking and redirecting them, then clapping in delight when they regrouped and carried on. It was the sort of absorbed fascination children know, but in him it seemed deeper, as though the ants were his equals in some secret order of life. The boy appeared only when the royal family was absent. The servants made sure of it. A few days before the king and queen returned, the boy would vanish from sight, taken indoors or perhaps moved to another wing entirely, as a child. The groundskeeper's son thought of him as a ghost, a friendly spirit haunting the gardens of Tullgarn. It was only years later, reading about the Bernadotte family, that he realized the boy had been a prince, one whose existence had been erased. Prince Carlos likely died around the age of 9, His burial unrecorded in public archives. No stone bears his name, no official chronicle notes his passing. His brief life survives only in the scattered memories of those few who saw him running barefoot through the palace grass, laughing under the Swedish summer sky, and kneeling for hours in communion with a world most royals never noticed. In 1868, Archduke Karl Ludwig of Austria, brother to Emperor Franz Joseph, was informed that his newborn son had died at birth. This, at least, was the version told to the family and recorded in the official court register. The truth never appeared in public. The infant had lived. But from the moment the midwife saw his face, she knew his life would be decided in whispers. The midwife, Anna Koller, left behind a small diary, discovered decades later when her descendants fled Vienna during the Second World War. In it, she wrote of the birth, the child's tiny stature, the set of his eyes, the way he clutched her finger with surprising strength. She described how, within hours, he was taken from his mother's chambers. The mother told he had not survived. Anna herself was sworn to secrecy, given a purse of gold, and warned that breaking her oath would mean death. Years later, Anna was summoned to a monastery outside Vienna to tend to a sick boy. She recognized him instantly, the same almond eyes, the same way of gripping a hand as though anchoring himself to the world. The monks called him Felix, meaning happy, and they believed he was an orphan entrusted to their care. Felix's life in the monastery was simple and consistent. He swept the courtyard, helped in the kitchen, carried water from the well. He had a deep affection for the animals in the stables, often sitting beside the horses and murmuring to them in a private language of pats and hums. The brothers adored him, speaking of his innocence as a kind of holiness. Anna's diary tells of her visits over the years. Felix would greet her with the same open smile every time, no matter how long it had been. He seemed untouched by the ambitions and cruelties of the world outside the monastery walls. In 1880, scarlet fever swept through the monastery. Felix fell ill quickly. The brothers tended him as best they could, but within days he was gone. The abbot wrote in the monastery's record book, "Our Felix has returned to God, who surely loves him better than the world ever could." No mention of his true parentage was ever made. His grave, marked only by a wooden cross, lay among those of humble brothers and workers, a place where no one would guess he had been born a Habsburg. But in Anna's diary, carefully hidden for more than half a century, his life endured not as a prince denied a throne, but as a boy who found peace in the quiet service of a monastery, and who was loved without condition. In 1889, within the Prussian court of Kaiser Wilhelm II's family, a boy named Waldemar was born to the emperor's sister. He was never presented to the public. Officially, his name appeared only in the most formal genealogical registers, with no mention of his life, no photographs, no public appearances to the outside world. He might as well have been a phantom. But one woman refused to let him fade into nothingness, his nurse, Emma Müller. Emma had been with him since infancy, tending to his needs, guiding him through seizures, calming him when the noise of the world became too much. She saw what the court would not admit, that behind his distinctive features and slow speech was a mind alive with its own passions. Each year, on his birthday, Emma commissioned a local artist to paint his portrait. She never told the court about these commissions. In each painting, Waldemar was rendered not as an oddity to be hidden, but as a young man of dignity, sometimes in his favourite railway conductor's cap, sometimes holding a book of bird illustrations, sometimes seated at the piano with his fingers poised above the keys. The portraits captured a boy growing into a man, his expression always lit by the quiet confidence of being seen. Waldemar loved trains with an obsession that bordered on encyclopedic. He could identify the model and year of any locomotive he glimpsed, reciting its routes and specifications. He had an equally uncanny ability to recognize bird calls, imitating them with such precision that the palace gardens often echoed with duets between him and the sparrows. Music, too, was part of his world. He could memorize entire orchestral pieces after hearing them just once, humming each part in perfect sequence. For 17 years, Emma kept this ritual, 17 portraits, 17 records of his life outside the reach of official history. But when Waldemar died in 1906, the court moved swiftly to ensure his absence was complete. Emma, heartbroken, tried to present the paintings to his mother as a memorial. Instead, she was met with cold refusal. The canvases were burned before her eyes in the palace courtyard, the last visual proof of Waldemar's existence reduced to ash within minutes. Emma never forgave them. She spent her remaining years writing letters to newspapers, pleading to tell his story, but no editor dared to challenge the royal family's silence. The letters were never published. After her death, they were found bundled together in a small trunk. In them, she described him simply: he was not less than, he was different than, and in God's eyes, different is not wrong. Today, Waldemar exists only in those hidden words and in the fading memory of a nurse who refused to let his life be defined by shame. The fire that consumed his portraits could not burn away the truth she carried that for 17 years. He was loved and valued by someone who saw him for who he was, not for what the court wanted him to be. In 1879, the House of Savoy welcomed a new Princess Giovanna into the royal palace of Turin from her birth. It was clear she was unlike her siblings. Her smile came easily, but her words slowly. And while other royal children were drilled in posture and protocol, Giovanna was more at ease with animals than with courtiers. In another family, she might have been simply the gentle daughter. In a royal dynasty, her difference became a challenge to be managed. The Savoys chose an unusual middle ground. Giovanna would not be hidden entirely, but her appearances in public would be rare, controlled to the second before each outing. Weeks of quiet rehearsals took place. Servants would guide her through the motions, the wave, the smile, the precise number of steps she could take without faltering until she could perform them on cue, at public events. She stood at a calculated distance, her presence framed as that of a delicate princess who could not endure long ceremonies. Inside the palace, Giovanna lived more freely than many of Europe's hidden royals. Her tutors discovered her extraordinary memory for music. She could hum back entire operatic arias after hearing them only once. She also had a natural ability with animals. Stray cats from the palace gardens would approach her unafraid. Dogs followed her through the halls, and even the skittish palace horses stilled under her touch. She was given a small household of servants who treated her as a person rather than a problem. They read to her, played games, and let her wander the palace's quieter courtyards. For Giovanna, these enclosed spaces were kingdoms of her own making, filled with music, animals, and the laughter of people who expected nothing more from her than herself. When she fell ill in her early 30s, the family closed ranks. Publicly, they announced she had retired from court life for health reasons. Privately, they kept her comfortable in her familiar rooms. In 1912, at the age of 33, she died quietly in her bed. Her funeral was private but dignified, attended by family and a few of the servants who had known her best. King Alberto I, her uncle, is said to have spoken a simple eulogy. She lived as God made her, and that was enough. In the annals of royal history, her name barely appears, but for those who knew her. Giovanna left behind a legacy of warmth and acceptance in a world where difference was so often met with walls and silence. In Belgium, the reign of King Leopold II is remembered for its ruthless exploitation of the Congo. But cruelty was not reserved for distant colonies. In 1864, his wife gave birth to a daughter who, within the palace walls, was quietly deemed unpresentable. She was never named in official records beyond the birth announcement. Within a few years, her room in the palace was literally walled off. Servants later recalled hearing a child's voice behind that wall singing nonsense songs, calling for a mother who never came. One maid, Marie Delacroix, took enormous risks to slip food and toys through a narrow gap near the floor. Sometimes drawings came back crude but joyful depictions of smiling faces, sons, and what might have been attempts at the word mama. Marie kept one a paper covered in small berry-coloured handprints, each surrounded by carefully drawn hearts. To her, it was proof that even in isolation, the princess longed to connect. In Romania, a different kind of secrecy unfolded. Crown Prince Carol's son was born in 1893 with obvious disabilities. Officially, he died within hours, but his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, a poet who wrote under the name Carmen Silva, seemed unable to accept this fiction. Her journals speak in coded language of the angel child too pure for earth and of visiting his star each night. Monastic records from that time show large anonymous donations for the care of a special child of God, with specific instructions he was to be taught music, given art supplies, and treated kindly. The payment stopped after 7 years, the same year the monastery recorded his death from a sudden fever. Greece's hidden child lived in the precarious interwar years, in the 1920s, while the Greek royal family was in exile. A physician was called to examine a teenage princess who did not officially exist. She had been born with Down syndrome and hidden from the start, raised in secrecy by a loyal servant. The doctor treated her for pneumonia and later described how she clung to his hand, calling him "nice man" one of the few phrases she knew. When he refused a bribe to solve the problem permanently, he fled Greece. He never learned her fate. 3 countries, 3 girls, 3 silences. Their worlds were walled rooms, monastic cloisters, and guarded apartments, different in setting, identical in purpose to keep them unseen, and in the faint traces they left a drawing pressed through a wall, a poem in a queen's journal, a remembered phrase in a doctor's memoir. We find the only proof that they lived at all. In the Netherlands, whispers have lingered for more than a century about a lost child of Queen Wilhelmina. Officially, she had only one daughter, Juliana, born in 1909. Yet household staff from the late 1890s told stories of a second pregnancy and a birth that resulted in no public announcement, in the province of Friesland. A farming family later claimed they had been asked by strangers dressed too finely for the countryside to take in a baby girl and raise her as their own. The arrangement came with generous payments, delivered in cash every season, but never with visits. The girl grew into a quiet, gentle woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to the Dutch royal family. She died in 1934, buried in a modest village cemetery, her origin still a guarded family secret, far to the north. Norway's monarchy was newly independent when it faced its first hidden tragedy. In 1912, Princess Ragnhild, the daughter of the future King Olaf V, was born and, according to official records, died after just 3 days. But seized Nazi documents recovered after World War II told another story. They revealed that a child with mongoloid features had been kept for 8 years in a discreet medical facility in Switzerland. A veiled Norwegian noblewoman visited monthly, always arriving and departing in secrecy. The records note the child's fondness for simple songs and her delight in feeding bread to the swans in the facility's pond. Her death in 1920 was attributed to influenza, but the physician's notes suggest complications from an untreated heart defect. There were other cases in the early 20th century scattered across Europe that followed the same pattern. An Austrian archduke's unnamed daughter kept on a secluded Tyrolean estate, seen only by her governess and 2 stable hands. A Danish prince's child spirited to a remote island under the care of retired palace staff. Each story ended the same way: a brief life, an unmarked grave, a family line that chose silence over acknowledgement. By then, photography was common, and public interest in royal children was at its peak. This made concealment both more difficult and more deliberate. Entire households were moved, staff dismissed and replaced with loyal outsiders, letters destroyed before they could leave the estate walls. The public was fed a steady diet of health excuses and tragic infant deaths. The truth that these children lived quietly for years, often loved by their immediate caretakers, never reached beyond a few trusted servants and the locked drawers of private archives. In these decades, as Europe slid toward world wars, the fate of hidden royals became even more precarious. Families feared not only scandal, but also political vulnerability if a rival power learned of a weakness in the bloodline. And so the silence deepened. Not just to protect the family name, but to protect the child from a world that could be even crueler than the palace walls. The Second World War changed the map of Europe and, in some ways, the way its monarchies handled their most closely guarded secrets. The Nazi regime's systematic euthanasia programs for the disabled, including those with Down syndrome, horrified even the royal families who had spent centuries hiding such children. For the first time, concealment was not only about avoiding scandal, it became a desperate act of protection. A hidden child could be more than a political liability, they could be a target. In Germany, families scrambled to move vulnerable relatives out of reach of state doctors and inspectors. Some were placed in remote convents or rural estates under assumed names. Others were smuggled across borders entirely. A handful survived the war this way, but many did not. The fear and shame that had once been private matters of dynastic image became tangled with mortal danger. In the post-war years, attitudes shifted slowly. By the 1950s, modern medicine was beginning to understand Down syndrome as a genetic condition rather than a moral failing. Longer life expectancy and better care made it harder to pass off these children as infant deaths. Still, full acceptance lagged behind. Secrecy remained the norm, even if the justifications were softer. A small but significant break with tradition came in 1957 in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. Prince Jean and Princess Josephine Charlotte had a son with Down syndrome and, in a move that startled court watchers, they acknowledged him publicly, not in speeches or public photographs, but in the frank admission that he lived in a special care facility, was part of the family, and was loved. This was not yet true inclusion, but it was a crack in a wall of silence centuries thick. In the 1960s and 70s, medical advances made open-heart surgery possible for children with congenital defects common in Down syndrome. Survival rates improved. These children could no longer be dismissed as inevitably short-lived. Public visibility increased, if only slightly, in Spain. King Juan Carlos's family in the 1970s openly acknowledged a nephew with Down syndrome, even allowing him to appear in family photographs. The act was quiet, but in royal terms, it was revolutionary. Yet old instincts persisted. In Britain, Sweden, and other monarchies, rumours of hidden children still surfaced, often without proof. Care homes in rural locations received generous anonymous donations, their residents unphotographed and unmentioned in public records. The families who had once quietly sent children to remote estates now sent them to modern institutions clean, comfortable, but still apart. The shift was real, but uneven. For every family willing to admit a child's existence, there were others who clung to the old ways. In some cases, the secrecy was less about shame than about control, a belief that the public had no right to scrutinise the most vulnerable members of the royal household. In others, the shadow of the past still loomed large, and admitting such a child felt like reopening centuries-old wounds in the dynasty's armour. It was progress, but measured in inches, not miles. The cages had more light now. The walls were farther apart, but they were still cages all the same. Centuries of secrecy leave their own kind of ruins, not the kind you can see in broken stone or faded tapestries, but in the absence the blank spaces where names should be, the portraits that were never painted, the graves that were left unmarked. For every documented story, there are dozens more that disappeared completely, erased so efficiently that no trace remains beyond a whisper in a servant's memoir or a rumour that outlived the generation who first spoke it. Historians debate whether these silences were born of cruelty, or if they were the product of a time when families, royal or otherwise, could not imagine another way to respond. Some argue the monarchies were simply mirrors of their societies, reflecting the prejudices of their age. Others say that because these families claimed divine right and superior blood, they bore an even greater moral burden and failed it. Both perspectives contain truth. But what is undeniable is the cost. Parents who might have learned to love their children as they were instead learned to view them as a source of shame. Siblings grew up never knowing brothers or sisters who lived only a few corridors away. And the children themselves, the ones locked in tower rooms, secluded in convents, or kept behind palace walls, were denied not only the public acknowledgement of their birth, but the simple affirmation that their lives had meaning. Even now, in the age of disability rights and public advocacy, old instincts remain. Modern royal families may no longer hide children in attics or claim sudden infant deaths, but the impulse to protect the image of the crown can still outweigh the impulse to integrate fully. A statement about privacy can be a shield sometimes for the child, sometimes for the institution. And yet, there is change. Some royal households have allowed children with disabilities to be photographed alongside their families, to be named, to be part of the narrative rather than an omission from it. These moments do not undo the past, but they do chip away at the centuries-old habit of erasure. They make it harder to imagine a future in which such a child would be invisible again. Still, the ghosts remain. They linger in the long corridors of palaces, in the gardens where a barefoot boy once watched ants, in the convent cloisters where a princess folded altar cloths. They live in the memory of nurses who kept drawings in locked boxes, of servants who risked their positions to pass toys through hidden gaps in walls. If history can teach anything from these stories, it is this: the measure of a civilization is not taken by the brilliance of its crown jewels or the grandeur of its palaces, but by how it treats those who cannot play the game of power. The hidden royals were never dangerous. What was dangerous was the truth they embodied, that human worth cannot be measured in lineage, perfection, or political usefulness. Picture once more the child in the Habsburg Tower room, watching the dust dance in a shaft of light. Centuries have passed, but you can still hear the silence pressing in, the door closing softly, the footsteps fading away. That child will never know how many others there were in France, Spain, Russia, the Ottoman court, each living out their days unseen. History has stolen their names, but it cannot steal the fact that they existed. They laughed, they cried, they loved, they mattered, and in remembering them, even in fragments, we break the silence their families built around them. We make them visible again, if only for a moment, and perhaps that is the beginning of a reckoning still long overdue.